Institute. Patrick, good morning, and how are you?
Good. How are you, Doug?
I'm fine. You know, the story broke, I guess, Friday afternoon and sort of started to swell over the weekend. There's an accusation being made that developer Paul McGraw inflated property values to be able to secure tax credits. That's what some officials in the city of St. Louis are saying, and they're upset about it. I can't help but say, playing devil's advocate, are we really surprised, not just because it's Paul McGraw, but because this is the sort of thing that happens all the time?
Yeah, everybody deserves their day in court, and I think this is, of course, part of an ongoing court proceeding, so there may be more evidence that comes out on either side on this. But it is concerning what the city is alleging here, and what the city is alleging is that back in 2011 there was kind of a purchase of a property, but it's not clear whether or not that purchase actually went all the way through. But they agreed on a number. They agreed on what the value of the property was, but there was supposedly no money that changed hands, but there was money that may have come from the state as a result of the price that they chose. And in fact, as part of the negotiations on that price, supposedly a representative, Paul McGraw, asked to raise the price, which means that if you're not going to actually exchange money, but you're looking to get tax credits from the state, it would actually increase the amount of money that you would be getting from the state through tax credits. And then by 2015 or 2016, that contract had been unwound, and and that's kind of where we're at right now. Is I think the previous owner, or I guess the current owner, is contesting what the value of that property was. The city values it at less. It's amazing, too, though, that unless this litigation had been ongoing, we may never have found out about these alleged happenings. So,
question again. I have I hearken back to Disney when they started buying up property down in Florida, outside of Orlando, and they were operating under shell corporations and so on and so forth because they knew that as soon as everybody else out down there figured out that it's Walt Disney Corporation and they want to buy up thousands of acres, that the property was going to change price significantly. Was that the case here, or was this actually, at least in the real estate industry, was it open knowledge that this was something that Paul McGraw and others were interested in? I think we just lost our line. I think we just lost our line with it.
Well, stand by. We'll get him back here in a second.
Okay, won't take. But you want me to take a break, or what would you like to do?
Going if we have more comments on the situation,
okay,
please.
Well, I just feel that it's not unusual, whether it's legal or not. That's where we get into it. Is whether state monies, in other words, the state was overpaying, if you will, in an indirect fashion because of this. But as our guest was saying,
he's back.
As Patrick was saying, and he's back with us now, that the deal was never consummated, which to me means either party can come back and say, not happy with the deal, we want more, we want to pay less, or we want to pay more. I don't think anybody will ever do that, but still, I guess the real question, Patrick, is where does this stand right now, and where is it heading down the legal path?
Well, that's a great question. Supposedly the city is considering going into, looking at hearings into that property, maybe another property that kind of looked the same sorts of discussions. And to your point earlier, and I think I caught most of it, the idea of having, separate companies that are all purchasing for a singular project. I don't know that there's really anything wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with trying to knit together enough properties so you can do something really spectacular with it if you think that thing that you're doing is spectacular. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that there is a difference, though. As soon as you start taking public money, there is a really it's very important that public officials are using the money appropriately, and that folks who are receiving that money are actually exercising they're being appropriate with that money as well. And so what's alleged here is that the value of the underlying properties here were not what Paul McGraw was supposedly taking to the state and getting money for. That is, I think, the big concern here. And I think that there's nothing wrong with knitting together all these properties with different companies. I think the concern here is that taxpayers may not be getting what they're paying for, and I think the court proceedings from here on in any future court proceedings will kind of prove out exactly what happened not only in 2011, but maybe in other years as well.
Yeah, this is the Buster Brown Shoe Factory building, which I don't think I mentioned earlier. It's at Jefferson and Cass. In some cases, you absolutely positively have to have that piece of real estate, which obviously means it's worth a heck of a lot more money. Was that the case here, or was this just part of this Northside Regeneration Company that Mr. McKee put together? And it was part, because I seem to recall seeing some maps that, I mean, he was cherry picking all sorts of piece of real estate up in North St. Louis at one time.
Yeah, that's a great question. And what Paul McKee and I think a lot of the folks that work with him would say, and they have said, is that that was a uniquely situated property that they could not do without. And that, of course, would impact the valuation that they would have for trying to purchase that property. Now, whether or not to anybody else it would be valued at several $1 million, or whether it would be valued more like $500,000, like the city valued it at, or $800,000, which I think is what the city ended up agreeing to back in 2016. That's a slightly different question. So I think the question of what the original valuation was with McKee is a little bit of a different question than what the valuation is today. But there is another concern about a 2012 transaction that was on Magazine Street, and the original owner bought that property for $35,000, and then shortly thereafter sold it for several $1 million.
Yeah.
And there was the same situation where that particular sale was unwound. So I think what's going to be very interesting is if there is more evidence, or the allegation that there is evidence suggesting that this was kind of a way of doing business that benefited, it sounds like, both parties through the tax credit side of it, where their initial outlay may be smaller, but they may be able to get public money at the same time. So whether this is part of a problem, a pattern remains to be seen. We don't know yet, but it'll be very interesting going forward whether the allegations that have been reported out there are allegations that end up being the truth.
Well, there's some really good questions. And the Post-Dispatch asked the Missouri Department of Economic Development, they're the ones who basically take care of the tax credit program, whether tax credits were clawed back. They declined to comment. The mayor of the city of St. Louis has said basically she was shocked to hear about the allegations. Jamila Nasheed, a state senator, is upset. And I guess what it all boils down to is if monies were paid, are Mr. McKee's corporations going to have to give that money back? And what's going to happen with the properties in question, as to who actually owns them now? And I'm going to guess it's Mr. McKee and his corporations that do. In other words, there's this is a big ball of twine that's going to have to be unwound, and it could take some time to get it taken care of.
Yeah, and the city is acquiring a lot of these properties, so they may own a lot of these properties currently. I think one of the overarching issues, though, is that what is the role of government when it comes to, quote, economic development? Mm-hmm. Because we're not just talking about the land assemblage tax credit or the historic preservation tax credit or Aerotropolis. I mean, there are so many different tax credits that the state issues, and that's to say nothing of local tax incentives. What is the role of government in these sorts of projects, or should we be letting the market operate? And if we think that there need to be, tax incentives, then maybe they should just take the form of tax cuts so that people can actually make their lives better off, make their companies better off, make their families better off. And that's one way to avoid problems like this.
I always use it as an example of how companies move around to suit their own fiscal needs. At one point in time, there was a Walmart that was located on Manchester Road, and it was Doherty Ferry, I guess it was. And then they moved out of that building, and they moved just a little bit further west, and now they're out by 141, and each and every time it's worked to their advantage. I don't necessarily have a problem with them moving. I just guess as a taxpayer, I'm kind of cheap that way, saying, well, if it's such a great move, you're basically cherry-picking from one community to another to move these buildings around. I realize this is a horse of a different color, but still, it's just part of the whole process.
It is kind of the same thing. I mean, the functions may be slightly different, but this is about public stewardship.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about public-private cronyism like that, and that's ultimately what it is. Walmart's a giant beneficiary of that sort of cronyism, as well as lots of other companies and lots of other developers. And so it is not the developer's fault that those programs exist. It is ultimately those of the fault of our public officials. And at some point, it requires stewardship on the part of public officials to rein those programs in and to actually start delivering value for taxpayers.
Listen, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Patrick Ishmael, Director of Government Accountability at the Show Me Institute, joining us this morning here on the Big 5.